it's really easy for us to talk about left wing versus right wing. It's really easy for us to talk about woke as contrasted to traditional because that is how we are trained to talk about politics, to talk about pop culture, to talk about media, to talk about literature. We're trained to think in those terms and speak in those terms by television, by the broadcast news, by formal education in our schools. But above all else, we're trained to think in those terms by religion. Anytime you just want to challenge yourself in a quick thought experiment, like this issue, does this really matter? Is this really of any cultural significance? Just hit pause in your brain and imagine how this looks from an Israeli perspective. Okay, all these movies get translated into Hebrew and they play in cinemas in Jerusalem for that tiny market, for that tiny amount of money. There's a subtitle version that's playing there. How do you think people in Jerusalem perceive the question of a black mermaid? Black Ariel, Black Little Mermaid. How do you think that looks from that perspective? All of these movies, all of them, get translated into Chinese, right? They're shown in theaters in Beijing, in Hong Kong. How does it look from a Chinese perspective? You think they don't notice? Now, whether they are laughing with us or laughing at us, everyone in China sees what's going on. Everyone in Israel sees what's going on. And they see it with a kind of detachment we're incapable of. But at the same time, they perceive it through their own religious baggage, their own religious lens, their own religious filter, their own religious bias, right? With their own political baggage, their own political lens and bias in a way that we can't imagine, or that seems preposterous to us, right? Like, oh, yeah. First, they elected Obama. Now, Catwoman's got to be black. Batwoman's got to be black. The Little Mermaid's got to be black. What's next? Mulan. Mulan has got to be black. What happens then? What happens when they all get it? And I mean, again, to some extent, they're laughing at you. To some extent, they're laughing with you. If you think this doesn't matter, if you think this isn't significant, just take a step back and look at it from a completely alien cultural perspective. Of course it matters. In the 1960s, there was a hit movie called Spartacus. Now, before that movie was made, I'm not saying nobody knew the name Spartacus, but it was not a common household word for people who had never studied Latin, never studied Greek, never taken an interest in history this way. There was a big, famous, mainstream Hollywood movie called Spartacus. What ethnicity was the actor playing the slave? The leader of the slave rebellion in Spartacus. Do you want to Google it? He was Jewish. Was a Jewish actor depicting a slave leader in a slave rebellion in ancient Rome. Black Spartacus? It's not actually my point here. My point is this. Why do you think that movie mattered so much in America at that time? And there's a weird sense in which we can say it still matters today. I mean, the 1960s were a long time ago. What do you think the demons were that Americans were wrestling with, right? What were the questions or uncertainties that film spoke to? It's obvious. Do you think it matters? Do you think it matters that the lead actor was Jewish in Spartacus? Let me put it to you another way. Do you think it matters that the lead actor was not black? Now, it had a significant relationship to the question of civil rights, African American. There's a relationship there, but it's a dotted line for the audience to trace for themselves. I understand how reassuring it is for people, whether they're on the left, on the right, or the center, to pretend that representation doesn't matter, to pretend that these stories don't deeply influence children in their upbringing. What seems to be fashionable right now amongst conservatives is to, on the one hand, when it is convenient for them, pretend that it doesn't matter for little girls growing up in America to see a white mermaid, white Ariel, to see a white blonde girl in Frozen, this Disney movie, to see white actresses and white heroines, both in the movies that are made for little girls and for the movies that are intended for an older audience, but that they really do see and they really are influenced by. It's convenient for the conservative, kind of anti-woke social media mob to pretend that this is of no significance at all. And then on the other hand, they will, without seeing the irony, point a finger at rap music and say, look at these cultural influences on young black people growing up in America. You know, look at DMX as a role model for black American males. Well, okay, a lot of children are influenced by DMX. And that's really my generation. I grew up around guys influenced by DMX. I grew up around guys influenced by Two Live Crew before DMX, going way back. Yeah, well, you know what? If you were black, or even if you were just Hispanic, if you were just non-white, how would Batman influence you growing up? How would Robin Hood influence you growing up? How would King Arthur influence you growing up? Now, I recently bought a copy of Batman Year One, and this is a kind of reckoning that's been a long time coming for me. I knew sooner or later I had to look at this comment again. You guys can do the math, and apparently I can't. I think I was 8 years old when I read this. Maybe I was 9 years old, but I think I was 8 years old. I read it. I could tell the whole story. I read it within a few months of the first publication, and I read the original printing of Batman Year One. So whether I was 8 or 9, the depiction of police brutality in this comic book shook me up and influenced me deeply. The depiction of police corruption influenced me deeply. The adversarial relationship between one policeman and another, policemen and lawyers, lawyers and City Hall and the policeman. These are things I had never imagined as a child at that stage. And the representation of race and racism was shocking to me. And I remember asking my father about it. So there's a scene here. You can't really see it because of the way the coloring is done. They've gone for this set of contrasting shades of red and purple. There's a black man here, and his hair is in cornrows. We don't know much about him. And he's snorting cocaine in front of his lawyer. Now, already for me as a child, the idea that we lived in a world where people did cocaine so openly and so fragrantly that they would do this in front of their lawyer, it's already shocking. And the lawyer says to him openly, I'm quoting verbatim, reading off the page here, quote, "Where do I start? It's bad enough that you're black. Right. I want you in a blue suit at the inquest with a tie. Make it black, same for the shoes. None of that pimp stuff. And when you smile at the jury, make it nice. So this is the lawyer telling this young black man that before he goes to court, he has to improve his appearance. It opens with the statement, "It's bad enough that you're black." Right? For a white lawyer to openly say to her black client that he's at a disadvantage in court, that's because of his race, this was shocking to me as a child, right? Like, the point being, the system is racist. Everyone involved knows that's racist, so on and so forth. This is one page out of this, work of some considerable length. One page out of 100, let's say. I don't know how many pages this runs. This comic book is not especially concerned with, it is not especially interested in race relations between white and black, the division between liberated descendants of slaves and the white majority. It's not really the interest. That brief moment acknowledging the depth of racism in the system, I got to tell you, that meant a lot to me as a child. I don't know how black kids reading this felt. Like, wow, here is an acknowledgement that the system is stacked against us. Like, they're reading that and they're thinking this has implications for me in a way that I didn't. Now, a bunch of ironies to mention here real quick. Who invented Batman? Okay. Batman was invented by a Jewish author. Okay, now, if you get into the whole list, who invented Spider-Man? Who invented the Fantastic Four? Marvel Comics has tried to retcon Ben Grimm to be Jewish in the Fantastic Four because it's very incongruous that they were Jewish creative writers who made a huge number of these characters. Superman. But none of the characters are Jewish, and none of them are in any obvious way about or dealing with the Jewish experience. Guess who the only exception is? Well, there are two. Right? The two Jewish characters who matter in comic books today are the Holocaust survivor in the X-Men, Magneto, right? And a guy who just recently got his own TV show / movie. The difference between a TV show and a movie is now blurred because this is all distributed over the internet. Mark Spector, Moon Knight. Okay. So the movie or TV show about Moon Knight, the actor is not Jewish. The actor does not look Jewish. There's no attempt made to deal with his Judaism or Jewishness. I think there is an interesting open question of whether a character like Magneto, whose Judaism and Jewishness is very directly tied to the Holocaust and the question of getting revenge against the Nazis after the Holocaust, whether that's going to be more relevant or less relevant now. Like, does that become meaningless? Does that just not make sense in 2023? Okay. Oddly, comic books at that crucial time, at the time when the most influential characters were invented at both Marvel and DC, comic book writing was dominated by a small number of very talented Jewish men. They were all men, none of them were women, and they were specifically Jewish. Now, why that is, it's a bunch of kind of strange coincidences. I have seen Stan Lee interviewed about it, and the reason he gave was the anti-Semitism at newspapers and magazines, that he didn't want to write for comic books. He wanted to be a writer, but he found he had no choice. He couldn't get ahead in magazines and newspapers. And again, this is not a story he's told once. It's a story he's told 100 times or a dozen times or what have you. Great question. Do you have a cold? From the audience. Blue Sky asked, do you have a cold? Let me ask you, would you rather be half sick 100% of the time or 100% sick 50% of the time? Yeah, I'm close to death here. We'll see. Maybe this is the last video I ever make. Give it a thumbs up and support me on Patreon before before the channel disappears. All right. My point is this: who is writing the story doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. If we're talking about children's literature, how children perceive the world, what children respond to, they are not going to be able to discern and respond to the subtext. You know, look back at Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, especially in their respective golden eras. These are not quite about Captain America. You know, it's very, very difficult to see how the Jewish experience is written in these comic books. I would say the exception again is the X-Men comic. With the X-Men and the contest between Magneto and Professor X, there you really clearly have Judaism and Jewishness entering into the narrative up on the surface, not on the subtext. What matters, as crude and vulgar and laughable as it may seem, what matters is what the left calls representation. What matters is actually telling a story that's, about Black people and address the Black people's problems, or if we're talking about Jewish people and the Jewish experience, address Jewish people and Jewish people's problem. It's got to be up on the surface. The thesis can't be submerged if we're talking about the effect this kind of literature, this kind of entertainment has on children. The problem is we're not dealing with the contrast between left and right. We're not dealing with the contrast between wrong and right. We're dealing with the contrast between bad writing and good writing. We're dealing with the contrast between something being meaningless, something being meaningful, and this is the most difficult to deal with of all. We're dealing with the contrast between something being in poor taste and something being in good taste. And the problem with having a Black mermaid, a Black Robin Hood, a Black King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, the problem with simply taking these characters and changing their ethnicity is precisely that it is meaningless rather than meaningful. It is bad writing rather than good writing, and it is in poor taste. Now, I don't think this began in the 2020s, and I don't think it began in the 2010s. For me, I think the shift happened. Maybe you guys can Google this and tell me what year it was. I think the shift happened with Will Smith when he appeared in the movie Wild Wild West. What sense does it make to have Will Smith as a Black cowboy fighting a giant robot spider in the Wild West? Even on the level of fantasy, where no one's pretending this is historically accurate, I find this really kind of dangerous and disturbing. Now, a comparison, there have been repeated attempts to reboot The Lone Ranger in a manner that meaningfully addresses genocide, racism, and slavery in America. Whether or not any of them have succeeded is another question. But you simply cannot have a Black actor play the part of the Lone Ranger and then use the same script that was used before with a white actor. That makes no sense. This is a society built on racial slavery. It's not the case that a Black man would be able to put on a mask and be a Texas Ranger. What a concept, but become a ranger, become a so-called lawman in the way that the Lone Ranger did. Now, my point is not that the fantasy itself is disturbing or evil, but it's really kind of damaging to raise children with this fantasy obscuring what the historical reality was. There's something that really matters there. There's something that's really important to communicate to your kids. Historically, a Black man like Will Smith could not have been this cowboy. A Black man could not have been the Lone Ranger. You really have to understand this. Now, again, the relationship between the Lone Ranger and Tonto and what's going on with the Native Americans. This is something that both in the comic books and in cinema, Hollywood has had to struggle with, again and again and again. Okay. However, I'm going to give you a counter argument here. I've never heard anyone on the left or anyone right or center present. I do think it's possible to change the ethnicity of a major character in a way that is very meaningful, in a way that is good writing rather than bad writing, and in a way that takes an idea that started in the 1930s and genuinely, with no sarcasm, makes it meaningful for modern audiences today. I think that's possible, and I think it's necessary. So let's talk about Batman. Let's talk about Batman Year One. Okay. Superman is just a space alien. In what way is it meaningful to have Superman arrive on Earth and be black, be African American? I'm not saying it's impossible to write that as a meaningful story, but okay, this is kind of starting with a really silly, meaningless premise. All right. Batman. His parents are very wealthy because his father was a medical doctor who started investing in big pharma, started investing in pharmaceutical chemicals. What if his father is an African American who worked very hard, put himself through medical school, right? Went from being poor to being slightly wealthy as a doctor, then gets into investing in chemicals. Now he's a multimillionaire. Interesting. What if his father is a black doctor who's doing his best to raise his son and give his son all kinds of advantages in life that he didn't have as a black man a few generations earlier, right? And then his father is shot dead on the street anyway. His father dies in some petty crime bullshit in the hood. Okay, this is already starting to sound interesting. Now we have a black teenager who grows up angry at the system, and he is raised by the servants and tutors his father hired to educate him before his death. So you have a black teenager who inherits millions of dollars, inherits a lot of kind of rage, resentment against the system, but he doesn't go to a normal public school with other black kids. He's raised by Alfred. He's raised by a servant, by a butler who is white. He's given an elite white education. He inherits a fortune as a multimillionaire, but he now lives in a society where he is neither accepted by wealthy white people, nor is he accepted by the average black person in America, who the average black person who, when they meet him, recognize right away his accent doesn't sound like ours. His manner of speaking doesn't sound like ours. His style of dress doesn't sound like ours. He's been raised in these very strange circumstances as an orphan, but an orphan with a peculiar set of privileges and disadvantages in life. That there are many steps in between Batman's witnessing of his parents' death and him putting on the ridiculous costume and punching people in the street. And those steps, Batman's sort of training, they're actually quite meaningless when he's just a millionaire white teenager. But today in 2023, they start to sound pretty interesting when you're talking about an angry black teenager. And an angry black teenager who neither fits in with sort of the wealthy elite of society that he's kind of been born and bred to be a part of, but who also doesn't find anywhere that he fits into in African American culture. Batman goes to Japan to study ninjutsu. When it's a white millionaire teenager, it's not that interesting. Okay, it's a black millionaire teenager who has to deal with the racism of the Japanese against him and who now reflects on racism in America in a whole different way, having had that experience in Japan. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Batman, normally he does some kind of spiritual seeking in Tibet, in Central Asia. You can have him in Central Asia, somewhere like Tajikistan, some mysterious place. They like to use fictional place names to be less offensive to people. Where he meets Ra's al Ghul, right? Ra's al Ghul, some people pronounce it Raz al Ghul. It is pronounced Ra's officially. When it's a black teenager meeting an elderly Arab man, Ra's al Ghul, we later find out he's several centuries old, not just several decades old. Okay. When it's an elderly Arab man who chooses him and says, I want you to marry my daughter, so on and so forth. Okay. When it's a black teenager with all these issues, okay, this is interesting. This is starting to be interesting. Now, even the most unpopular of the Robins, when Batman took on these different boys to be Robin, right? One of the Robins, I'll get the name wrong now. It's not Dick Grayson. It's not Jason Todd. It's the one in the middle, I think. There's a kid trying to steal the hubcaps off the Batmobile in the streets. There's a poor, tough kid involved in street crime. And Batman tries to adopt this kid and take him in and train him to be Robin, but also to give him revenge. Now, it was discussed at DC Comics at that time. It was discussed probably because Hollywood wanted to make a movie with a black actor playing Robin, having a white Batman and a black Robin. This was discussed for many years, trying to have some black role in the Batman mythos. But at the comics, they felt it was just so prejudicial if you had a black kid on the street trying to pull the tires or pull the hubcaps off of the bat, trying to rob Batman. And then Batman taking pity on this kid. Batman is the white millionaire adopting the black kid. They felt that was just too explosive, too hot to handle. All right. Okay. But now it's a black Batman. And let's say he's trying to adopt a kid, and this kid is more street smart than he is. This kid grew up in the hood. Batman didn't. Batman is black, but he was raised by these wealthy tutors. He was raised by Alfred. He's somewhat detached by reality. He's been to Tibet. He's been to Japan, but maybe there are things he still doesn't understand himself about the streets of Gotham. And this younger black kid does. This black kid grew up with it, and he knows. And he's in a position to order Batman around, or at least sass Batman, talk back to Batman and say, look, you don't understand what's going on with these drugs, whatever the situation is. Oh, now this is starting to sound interesting. In so many different ways, a black Batman is really interesting. It could be the basis for good writing or great writing, right? But a black mermaid, a black King Arthur, a black Mulan can't be. There just can't possibly be anything interesting or challenging there. We really are just taking a story that used to have a white protagonist, and we're changing the ethnicity of the main character without changing anything else. Now, again, guys, I'll look at your comments in just a second. Thank you. Any intelligent comments are appreciated. Also, if you hit thumbs up, that's appreciated for what it's worth. There was a lot of discussion when Power Man and Iron Fist was being remade into TV shows and movies, whatever say streaming shows. Should the character of Iron Fist now be Chinese? Should the character of Iron Fist now be Korean, Japanese, some kind of Asian, Filipino? Iron Fist is white. He's a kung fu master. A lot of people are looking at this thinking, does it really make sense having a blonde white guy who's a kung fu master? Well, the only period in which the Power Man and Iron Fist comic book mattered was exactly the period in which it dealt with the friendship between a black man and a white man. So, Hero for Hire, aka Power Man, was a blaxploitation character. His comic book was all about the black experience. I mean, sorry, if you guys go back and read that stuff, your mind will be blown how political it is and how racial it is. It's about race in America. It's about the ghetto, the hood. It's about race issues. It's not about anything else, you know. And then what they did was they put this black hero, who again, it's not a subtle background aspect of his character that he's black. Very much the main thing about that character originally is that he's black and he's poor. And the recurring trope of his story is that he keeps saying that he doesn't want to be a hero. He just wants to make money. He just wants, he wants to buy a house. He wants to buy a fancy car, whatever. He's just in it for the money, but he ends up reluctantly being a hero. He ends up doing the right thing and not getting paid. Like he ends up doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And then at the end of the story, he's still broke and he's still complaining that he's leper. So he is very much a poor black man in the hood. That's what his character is all about. And he was paired with, it was put together with a white character. And again, you can, what do you want to do with this white character? The white character is kind of an eccentric guy who went to Asia and studied kung fu and became a kung fu master. It's like, white guy who converted to Buddhism or something. Okay, I'm not saying that's the greatest premise. That idea for a comic book maybe was meaningful in the late 1970s, and maybe that's not meaningful anymore in 2023. Like, is it such a big deal for a big muscular black guy to go to the gym with his best friend who's a white dude, a relatively skinny white dude who's into kung fu? He's also very muscular, but just in comparative terms, at that time, that was thrilling. And people bought the comic just for the witty banter between the two of them. This big black guy and his smaller white friend walking to the gym together. That was thrilling and that was exciting. Now, you can make the argument that that's still meaningful in 2023. Maybe they're walking down the street and they're talking about the death of George Floyd. They're talking about BLM. Like, maybe you really make it contemporary. You really make it matter. But I thought that was an interesting moment in terms of how people are just sleepwalking through these issues. Well, if you want to change the ethnicity of the white character there, if you want to make him Chinese, now you're talking about a comic book, a movie, a TV show that is centrally about the bromance, the male friendship, the friendship between a black man and a Chinese man. Now, I just ask you, can you write that story? I've lived in China. I've worked in China. I've studied Chinese. China's been a huge part of my life. And whatever. I grew up Jewish in downtown Toronto. I knew a lot of black people. I saw a lot of black people, but I am not in any way part of the black experience. I've got to tell you something. I think a brilliant writer could create something really great out of that, where it's about the relationship between Black Americans and East Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, what have you. But wow, that for me as a writer is somewhat intimidating. And I got to tell you, the other idea I just pitched to you guys, really seriously rewrite Batman as a black teenager from year one forward, so to speak. Really deal with the situation of a black kid whose father was an accomplished medical doctor who nevertheless was gunned down in the streets over some bullshit. A black kid who grows up rich, but for that reason, alienated from other black teenagers. He can't get along with other black teenagers, and they don't think he's cool. He's rich, but he's been raised by Alfred and a team of tutors and what have you. He's been given the best education he could possibly get. But that education made him into something like George Plimpton. Like, he doesn't fit into black society, and he also doesn't fit into the elite Ivy League white society. Those people also don't like him, don't get along with him. And he's angry. and he hates the cops, and he knows that the cops are corrupt, and you can imagine, you start to fill in these different. Okay, wow, this is now a story that's really meaningful in 2023. And this kid, so I'll mention a couple of things out of Batman's background. One part of his origin story, I already mentioned, he goes to Japan, he goes to Tibet or something. He has a period of kind of seeking this way. Okay, he also, part of his origin story is that he works with a private detective in Louisiana to learn how to be a detective. That's pretty boring when you're talking about a white kid, a white millionaire who pays this detective to spend some time with him in Louisiana. It's just not that. Okay, a black millionaire from, we don't know, from the Catskills, from the greater New York City area or something, black millionaire from the Northeast going down to Louisiana and learning how to be a detective and learning about police corruption. And again, we know in the audience, this is a black millionaire who later becomes Batman. But at that time, he doesn't know that's what he's going to do yet. He wants to learn how the system works. He wants to learn how to be a detective. Oh, and another big one, Volume 1 of Legends of the Dark Knight indissolubly links the origin of Batman to First Nations spirituality, Aboriginal people spirituality, Indigenous American spirituality. Very strange story, but very influential. Now, again, when you're talking about a white millionaire, who has a skiing accident and then he has a connection with an indigenous shaman or, native medicine man, and he's part of this ritual. Yeah, the white millionaire gets rescued by native people. It's kind of weak. It's not interesting. Okay, resentful black teenager facing up to and dealing with the legacy of genocide and colonialism. This is starting to get interesting, and again, partly that's just urban versus rural. Like, he grew up in a mansion, I don't know, in the Catskills, to say, in the greater New York area, however we imagine this. Because Wayne Manor is not downtown. His mansion is not. It's not urban in its setting. It's out in the hills somewhere. However we imagine the location of his mansion. But okay. So now, in a totally unironic sense, we're talking about a reinterpretation of a story that originates in the late 1930s. I mean, it's originally based on a Jewish writer in New York just ripping off and recycling a single story about the Shadow. And if you don't know, the Shadow at that time was popular through radio and was popular through short novels, not comic books. There's one story from the Shadow that gets ripped off and reinterpreted by this writer, who is also trying to, in a sense, rip off the success of Superman. Superman had come out just a couple months earlier, as I recall, maybe even 1 month earlier, I forget. But Superman was a huge hit. So, okay, we got to make up a new kind of Superman. He reads this one story about the Shadow and rips it off, reinterprets it, and very rapidly puts together the Batman character. It goes from there. Okay, well, if you think changing the ethnicity of the character to update the story, to reinvigorate the story, to make it meaningful in our times, if you think that's fruitless or pointless or is always and inevitably doomed to failure, I think I've just given you a great example of how, no, it can take something meaningless and suddenly make it meaningful, suddenly give it a very different angle in terms of, social criticism, and not even social criticism, just holding up the mirror to society and asking, where do we come from? Where are we going? Now, I think there are other questions to ask. I think, all right, I'm going to have to make a separate video talking about this comic book and, frankly, the way in which I feel it psychologically damaged me growing up. And I think I have a lot to say about the way in which mainstream culture and literature, this kind of, it really does influence us, maybe more than we want to admit it does. Why are we so uncomfortable dealing with the question of what is good writing? Why are we so uncomfortable dealing with the question of what is in good taste and what is in bad taste, what is meaningful and what is meaningless? Well, my answer is because we have a system of education, a system of religious education, of religion, and then also informal sources like the TV news media. We're trained to only think in terms of judgments of good and evil. And what we're dealing with here, it's not about good and evil. It's not. It's about meaningful versus meaningless, good writing versus bad writing, and what's in good taste versus what's in bad taste. So in case you guys didn't know, there was a movie made about Batwoman, not Batman, Batwoman. And they had an actress. People say she was black. To me, she appears to be more Latino than black. Obviously, she probably has some African ancestry, but I'd assume she identifies more as Hispanic than African American. I don't know. But anyway, a person of that kind of background playing the role of Batgirl or Batwoman, who previously was a white woman with red hair. Now, the film was completed. It was a very big budget film with some very expensive actors in small roles. And a lot of people were anticipating it for that reason. The film is reportedly so bad, it's so awful, that the studio decided to bury it. And you can imagine there's a certain perspective, certain kind of right-wing, anti-woke perspective that wants to fast on this and say, hey, we told you so. You know, okay, just 1 second. Will Smith in Wild Wild West. Will Smith in Wild Wild West. We told you so. Okay. Johnny Depp in The Lone Ranger. We told you. Let's get serious. Let's get serious about representation and race and writing, and trying to make a meaningful statement that conveys something to children, and at the same time is entertaining to adults. Like, the problem with Batwoman or Batgirl is not that she's black rather than white. The problem with Catwoman has been black several times over. Now, there's several different versions of Catwoman that are black. The problem is not going to be just black versus white. But it seems like we have a culture in which the only way we can articulate a complaint is morally. Everything has to be treated as a moral issue, as a distinction between good and evil, as a religious issue, right? And you say, so take a step back. How do you think this looks from the perspective of someone in Jerusalem right now? They get the same movies. All the same crappy Hollywood movies get subtitles in Hebrew. Just how surreal is this debate from the perspective of someone in Jerusalem? Beijing, China. Whether they get them as an illegal, pirated DVD, or they actually see it in the theater, all the same Hollywood movies show up in China, whether they download them illegally or whatever. Okay. Just think about how bizarre this is. Like, oh, Americans are fighting over whether Catwoman should be black or white again. Americans are fighting over whether the Little Mermaid should be black or white again. And again, okay, I'm sorry, I got to wrap up this stream. I can't go on forever. But I promised you guys I'd read your comments, so I'll take a moment to do so. What education do you think these writers have? Who taught them what good writing means? So I think I have a question here about going to film school. Yeah, so okay, I might as well do it now. Sam writes, quote, when you were looking into film school, did script writing ever appeal to you, or were you strictly looking for directing and cinematography instruction? So the problem is the quality of education that exists in writing is just abysmal. It's just awful. I mean, you can look into it, but do you think you're going to learn anything? Do you think anyone learns anything? Now, but real quick question. Obviously, the problems that people are complaining about now about woke writing in Hollywood, obviously, they are 100% the result of the poor quality of university education, right? The poor quality in terms of actually learning how to write, actually learning how to be a filmmaker, so sort of the poor quality of it. Okay. But do you actually think that problem of the quality of education is on the left wing only? If we just stop and take a look at conservative universities, at right wing universities, the United States of America has many. Do you think you're going to find really exemplary education programs in filmmaking, in screenwriting, in creative writing of any kind? If you look into, I mean, you can Google it right now. There are conservative Christian universities. There are conservative Mormon universities. There are conservative Jewish universities. There are conservative Muslim universities. There are a lot of right-wing universities. I think almost all of them are affiliated with a religion. You tell me, can you name a right-wing university, a conservative university that is atheist, that is really anti-religion? There may be zero in America. There may be zero in the whole world. Within England, within the United Kingdom, there are conservative and right-wing universities too. Again, they all, college by college, they all have a religious affiliation. You are dreaming if you think those more conservative and right-wing universities are providing people with a better education to be able to write the next Batman, to be able to write the next Little Mermaid, to be able to write the next Star Wars. I'm very much aware Star Wars has struggled with, trying to say something meaningful this way. So yeah, the people on the left, the so-called white people, the so-called woke people, yeah, the quality of their writing is absolutely terrible. It's abysmal. But it's ridiculous to pretend this is a problem with left-wing education only. I would say the problem is even deeper and even worse on the right wing. And that's why there are incredibly few conservative creative writers, conservative filmmakers, or right-wing authors and filmmakers. I mean, every so often there is one, but it's rare. I mean, obviously Hollywood is dominated by the left, and that reflects the fact that education in the liberal arts is indeed very liberal. Now, by contrast, if you want to get an education in economics and being a stockbroker, right, you're primarily dealing with conservative and right-wing institutions and conservative and right-wing people. Unless you go and get a Marxist education in economics, and then good luck. Yeah. So coming back to Sam's question that I've already quoted, part of the problem with education is just the question of what are you buying, and I'm not going to pay thousands of dollars to just have a bunch of pep talks. If I'm getting hands-on training with cinematography, with filmmaking per se, that's worth money. Bunch of pep talks about how to be a writer is worthless to me. And most of the time, I won't respect the professor. Most of the time, I'll think I'm a better writer than the professor. There are exceptions. There are some professors who are also great writers who I would feel I have something to learn from them. But like in the American tradition, education in creative writing is not worth paying for. It's not worth having. It's a waste of my time as well as a waste of money. So great question here. Would you make a villain like the Joker black? And then there's another question. What about having the Joker as Hispanic? Yeah. Well, I've got a better question for you. I mean, so who is the villain in Batman? And I think the real question is, are you willing to commit to making Batman a tragedy rather than a comedy, where he's not a hero, he's a tragic figure, where he's like what he's doing is self-destructive and he can't win. I think that's important. But the real enemy, the real villain in Batman is the police, right? Again, this was shocking to me as a child. Batman fights against the police. So here's the real question. I respect your question, but my question is better. You ask, if Batman is black, is the Joker black? If Batman is black, is the Penguin black? If Batman is black, the mayor, the corrupt mayor, okay? Google this name right now, Kwame Kilpatrick. The United States of America has a great history of corrupt African-American mayors. But what if the mayor, I'm giving you the spelling so you guys can Google it. What if the corrupt mayor, what if the corrupt chief of police is black? I mean, I think probably most of them. What if the mayor is black, like Kwame Kilpatrick, and the head of the police is white? And that's the real conflict. Because Batman ultimately it's about corruption. And what's the opposite of corruption? Well, what if your alternative is corrupt? What if the alternative to corruption is a multimillionaire lunatic who's out for revenge after his parents were shot dead in the street? And it's pretty crazy. But yeah, and I think the real way to redeem Batman in the 21st century is to make him a tragic figure, where what he is doing is not heroic, it's self-destructive. And it ends that way. He doesn't win. Like obviously he can win some battles along the way, but in the end he loses the war. In the end he dies. He has to be a tragic figure, not a heroic figure. Batman, whether it's a trilogy or just one film, it has to end with burying Batman. It has to end with Robin standing over Batman's grave and saying, "You were wrong. You fought the wrong war. You tried to solve a problem with your fists that cannot be solved with your fists. This can't be solved by punching people out. This isn't even the way to deal with police corruption. Like there's something really meaningful there, but it has to be tragic. It can't be that Batman wins. Like, oh yeah, it used to be that the police are corrupt, and now they're not corrupt anymore because one violent psychopath started punching them in the face. That can't possibly be the end of the story. Yeah, the comic books have repeatedly toyed with the idea of the Joker being homosexual, and they never commit to it. The Joker has been reinvented and reinterpreted so many times. Yeah. So we have a mention here of a specific Christian conservative college. I've never heard anything positive about the quality of education at any conservative college. Not any, not even in economics. I've never heard anything positive about it. I've never heard anything positive about studying at the Mormon universities. I've never heard anything positive about studying at any Muslim university. And look, again, I'm Jewish. I'm stuck with it. I don't have a choice about that. I've never heard anything positive about any of the Jewish conservative or religious colleges, universities. Like whether you mean within the United States or within Israel, the only ones that have any value or anything good going for them are they're the least Jewish, they're the most anti-religious, they're the most liberal and most atheistic, so on and so forth. Okay, guys, so that's the whole stream. And, the conclusion I have for you is whether you are looking at political problems that are shallow or profound, challenge yourself to step beyond and step outside of the religious mentality. Challenge yourself not to think in terms of moral judgments of good and evil, right and wrong. Challenge yourself not to think in terms of the pre-established political spectrum of left versus right, or so-called woke versus traditional. Do they call themselves traditional? Whatever the opposite of woke is. Challenge yourself to think in your own terms. What is meaningful? What is meaningless? What would be a good story? What would be a better story? Because ultimately, as I say in my own books, you can see one of them in the background there, the challenge we have for the century ahead is to transform our own culture. And either you are going to do that through violent revolution, or you are going to do it through democratic politics, or you are going to do it through the telling of new stories. Because my children and my grandchildren have to read something better than this. They have to be able to read something better than Batman, and better than The Little Mermaid, and better than Disney's Mulan or Disney's Frozen, right? We have to start producing better stories, illustrated children's storybooks, better cartoons, better entertainment here on YouTube, better stand-up comedy for adults, better triple X pornography for all I care. But we have to start telling new stories. We have to be creative as intellectuals if culture is going to change. And please note that I say change. You know, progress is an ideology. Change is an objective fact.